Suge Knight. Just the name was enough to send a chill down every rapper's spine in the 90s. Dubbed the boogeyman of the hip-hop industry, Suge Knight wasn't just feared, he was outright dreaded.
He came, it was like, Suge's outside, Suge's outside. Everybody like, it was running, dropping shit, like, man. Everybody
They was not scared of Suge Knight. They was terrified of Suge Knight.
Right.
I mean, terrified.
There's a story about him gathering a group of producers in his apartment and laying it out plain. Either y'all start producing some hits, or I'ma start producing some hits.
Suge had an apartment full of producers, and I guess they wasn't coming up with the right songs. Yeah. And he gathered them all up and said, look, either y'all start producing some hits or I'm gonna start producing some hits.
And Suge wasn't known for empty threats. He had no problem using whatever means necessary to get what he wanted. It's been reported that one unfortunate person was beaten so badly, they were even forced to drink Suge's.
He might have got a few punches, and he probably drunk about 20 shots of piss. You know what I mean? Literally.
At the peak of his power, Suge Knight was the CEO of Deathrow Records, a label that dominated the 1990s and left an indelible mark on hip-hop history. But his reign wasn't just about music. It was also marked by controversy and crime. One moment that stands out was his infamous speech at the 1995 Source Awards, directly taking a jab at Sean P. Diddy Combs.
And one other thing I'd like to say, any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the video, all on the record, dancing. Come to Deathrow.
That bold diss was heard around the world, and it stirred the pot in a major way. But for all his success, Suge's ruthless tactics would cost him dearly. His career unraveled, his freedom was taken, and some say he even sealed his own fate in other ways. To truly understand how he became such a feared figure, you have to go back to his early life. Born on April 19, 1965, in Compton, California, the man who would later be known as Suge, short for Sugar Bear, a childhood nickname given to him by his father, grew up in an environment that would shape his notorious approach to business and life. In the late 60s and 70s, Compton transformed from a predominantly white middle-class suburb into a mostly black community that would become the epicenter of West Coast hip-hop culture. It was here that Marion Knight's cold-blooded ruthlessness was forged. His father, Marion Knight Sr., worked as a janitor and truck driver, a hard-working man who instilled discipline in his son. Meanwhile, his mother, Maxine, was known in the community for her strength and resilience. These early influences would later manifest in Suge's relentless drive and determination, though perhaps not in the ways his parents might have hoped. Ever since he was a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, Marion Knight saw things most of us can't imagine. He first witnessed murder when some punk was shot dead just for telling off a couple of dudes whistling at his girl. Suge later said living in the hood turns you into a cold-blooded shark. And man, he wasn't kidding. As a kid, he'd wander into crime scenes, digging through bodies for rings or cash. One time, he found $5,000 and gave half to his mom. In 3rd grade, visiting speakers asked the kids what they wanted to be when they grew up. Suge yelled, "A football player!" And they laughed. "You've got as much chance as a black guy becoming president," they said. So Suge flipped them off, told his teacher, and shrugged when they said he was going to the principal's office. "Send me," he said. Dropping Bear in his name, he became Suge Knight, a bodyguard for hire. Toward the end of the 80s, Suge was already running security for big names like Bobby Brown. Then in October 1987, it blew up. First, he got busted for beating his girlfriend in the street, reportedly yanked her hair so hard he chopped off her ponytail. Right after that, cops say he stole a car that had hidden weapons inside, but it didn't stop there. While trying to jack the ride, he supposedly shot at the driver 3 times, grazing the guy's ankle. He was later arrested and charged with car theft and attempted murder. In court, he somehow talked his way into a 2-year probation instead of prison. In 1990, Suge got charged again for carrying a weapon in public. Standing before everyone in court, Suge looked up, shrugged, and said, "By God, as if nobody in the world makes mistakes, we all do sometimes. You find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's my situation." Toward the early 90s, Vanilla Ice was blowing up with his track Ice Ice Baby. But Suge smelled money that wasn't landing in his camp. He'd been told the song's real writer was a guy named Mario Johnson, a dude on Suge's payroll. So Suge did what he does best, get what he wants by any means necessary. First stop was a pizza joint where Vanilla Ice was grabbing a slice. They rolled up, took some pics, kept it friendly at first. Then Suge said, "Let's talk upstairs." Next thing Ice knew, he was on a 15th floor balcony, surrounded by Suge's men. They demanded he hand over the rights. Ice tried to play it cool, but his bodyguard got shoved and slapped down by Suge himself. In an interview, Vanilla Ice later gave specific details of what happened that night. In his words, "Suge took me out to the balcony like the 15th floor. He had me look over the edge and showed me how high I was. I needed to wear a diaper on that day."
First time I met Suge Knight was at a restaurant in LA called Palm Restaurant. And I was sitting there eating, nice meal, and all of a sudden these huge guys, looked like a football team, showed up. You know, it was very intimidating to see these guys. They were bigger than my bodyguards, you know, and a bunch of them. And they pretty much grabbed my bodyguard and pulled him out and sat down next to me right there and started talking to me. "How you doing?"
Uninvited?
Totally uninvited. I didn't even know him.
See him again?
Sure did. Saw him again a few months later. He did the same thing, just kind of showed up to me, said hi, and then left. Still thinking, well, wow, this guy knows where I'm at all times. How does he know where I'm at? You know? What's going on?
Publicly about it for the first time, Van Winkle describes a terrifying night in his suite at a Beverly Hills hotel when he says Suge Knight showed up with 6 other men.
Roughed one of my bodyguards up. They roughed everybody else and my whole entourage up. Suge took me out on the balcony, started talking to me personally.
On the balcony?
On the balcony.
High above?
Like 15 floors. He had me look over the edge, show me how high I was up there.
Were you scared?
I needed to wear a diaper on that day.
That was the moment he signed everything over, royalties, rights, everything. Back in the studio, Suge and his crew split the cash. And Ice, he lost millions. And Deathrow just got richer off a hit they didn't even produce. But then this situation with Vanilla Ice was just the start. In 1991, Dr. Dre was fed up with his record label. He'd been the architect behind NWA's sound, but every dollar he earned seemed to vanish into Jerry Heller and Eazy-E's pockets. So Dre calls up his boy DOC for help. DOC hits up Suge Knight, who's already making waves as the guy who gets asses beaten. Suge takes Dre's deal to Dick Griffey at Solar Records, and Griffey straight up tells Dre, "Bro, they're robbing you blind." After that, they set up a renegotiation meeting with Eazy and Jerry, supposedly with Dre. But instead of Dre, Suge shows up with his crew. Either you free Dre from that goddamn contract, or things get ugly. No punches thrown, because the message was clear. But Eazy was smarter than they thought. He cut a fake signature to let Dre go and snagged 20% of everything Dre made for the next 6 years. With Dre now free, he and Suge launched Deathrow Records. That move flipped hip-hop on its head. As Deathrow Records began to take off in early '92, right after The Chronic is blowing up, Dr. Dre invites 2 fresh-faced rappers, Lynwood and George Stanley, into the Deathrow studio for a recording session. During the session, Lynwood picks up the studio phone to make a quick personal call. Problem is, that's the exact line Suge uses to talk to big money backers. Suge storms in and snaps, "Hang up that phone." Lynwood fires back, "Don't bug me with this gangsta shit." Before they know it, Suge's crew hauls them onto the Red Room, strips them down to their boxers. Then they pummel them. To make sure they never snitch, Suge snatches their IDs saying, "You call the cops, we'll find you." Battered and bruised, Lynwood and George actually defied Suge's warnings. They march straight to the DA's office and file assault charges. The case lands with prosecutor Larry Longo. He's all set to go after Suge until Suge pulls his trump card. Turns out, Longo's 18-year-old daughter was an aspiring singer who needs a lot of promotion. Suge offers her a record deal in exchange for him to close the case. 1 minute Longo's ready to lock Suge up, the next he's mysteriously agreed and accepted the deal. Word is, he even got fired from the DA's office after this incident. Without Longo sticking with it, the case just fizzles out. No witnesses show up, the DA loses interest, and charges drop. Lynwood and George get nothing. Meanwhile, Deathrow keeps cashing checks, and everyone figures out one thing: Suge plays by his own rules. Aside from Lynwood and George Stanley, plenty of others have felt Suge's ruthlessness. In the mid-1990s, during an interview with the New Yorker magazine, the New Yorker journalist began asking probing questions about Suge's notorious reputation for violence. Knight, never one to appreciate direct questioning about his methods, began giving evasive, carefully crafted responses. As the interview progressed, the journalist became increasingly frustrated with Knight's non-answers. In a moment of journalistic frustration, he called out Knight's response, saying, "Come on, man, that answer's bullshit." In an instant, Knight transformed from a calculated businessman to a terrifying physical threat. He grabbed the journalist, dragging him forcefully across the room. Near the studio's wall was a large tank filled with piranhas. Knight shoved the journalist's head towards the tank, asking with a chilling directness, "How about if my fish eat your fucking face?" After thoroughly terrorizing the writer, Knight threw him back into his chair and said, "Rewind the tape and ask me those questions again." But while Suge was beating cases and shoving reporters' heads in piranhas, a storm was brewing on the East Coast. By the mid-90s, Puff Daddy's Bad Boy was everywhere, blowing up on magazines, MTV, and the radio, while Deathrow was stuck in courtrooms and headlines. Suge Knight hated seeing that. Fast forward a few months to the Source Awards. Dr. Dre wins Producer of the Year, but Suge wasn't there to celebrate. As soon as he stepped on stage, he took shots at Diddy, saying, "If any artist out there wants to be a star and not worry about the producer dancing in their videos, come to Deathrow."
And one other thing I'd like to say, any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the video, all on the record, dancing, come to Deathrow.
In actual fact, this wasn't just a diss, it was the truth. Diddy was always in the videos of his artists dancing like a clown. In the coming weeks, Puff fired back in interviews, calling Deathrow outdated, while Suge ran magazine ads dubbing Bad Boy Paper Tigers and Puff soft. But this wasn't always how they were. In fact, Suge and Diddy were very good friends. "We used to kick it in the studio together and Suge was like my big brother," Puff said in an interview. Between 94 and 95, Bad Boy exploded with the album Ready to Die, which went platinum. Diddy was on cover stories, trading Billboard 1-2s with Deathrow singles. On paper, Bad Boy was winning. And Suge? He wasn't used to being second fiddle. "I saw Suge's face change," Keefe D later recalled. He wasn't happy seeing Puff get all that shine. Suge hated how puffed up media coverage painted Bad Boy as the new boss of rap, while Deathrow was mired in courtrooms and B-list beef. But this back and forth with Bad Boy was one of the least problems Suge had, because at that same time, Snoop was been detained when his bodyguard, McKinley Lee, shot and killed Philip Woldemariam, a member of a rival gang. Along with Snoop, his bodyguard, Lee and Snoop's friend, Nate Dogg, were also implicated in the case. This is where Suge Knight stepped in, showing a different side to his otherwise ruthless character. When Snoop turned himself in to authorities in 1993, Suge immediately mobilized Deathrow's resources to secure his freedom. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, the same legal team that would later represent O.J. Simpson.
So I took him because I knew one thing. For me to make this dude the most hottest artist in the world, people gotta see him. So I know we taking up his chance, but at the same time, it's his job to be an artist and promote this stuff. And then when they come to arrest him, it's my job to get him out of there.
While the legal proceedings dragged on for nearly 3 years, Suge ensured that Snoop and Nate Dogg could still work on their music. He converted a room in the Deathrow offices into a temporary recording studio, so that Snoop could record his debut album Doggy Style while wearing an ankle monitor. The support Suge provided wasn't just financial. He used his connections and intimidation tactics to keep witnesses from testifying against Snoop. According to several sources, Suge's reputation in the streets was enough to make potential witnesses suddenly forget what they had seen. A former Deathrow security guard revealed, Suge would send guys into the neighborhoods to talk to anybody who might testify. He'd say, make sure they understand what happens to snitches. And people got the message real quick. During the trial, Suge made sure his presence was felt in the courtroom. He would show up with an entourage of intimidating figures, sitting directly behind Snoop as a show of force to the jury and everyone else in the room. The strategy worked. In February 1996, after a 3-month trial, Snoop and his bodyguard were acquitted of first-degree and second-degree murder charges.
Versus McKinley Lee, Los Angeles Superior Court case number BA086649. We, the jury, in a above entitled action, find the defendant, McKinley Lee, not guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree.
Though the jury deadlocked on voluntary manslaughter. The defense successfully argued that Snoop's bodyguard had acted in self-defense. Nate Dogg, who was also implicated in the case but faced lesser charges, benefited from the same legal protection. Suge's intervention quite literally saved both artists from spending decades behind bars and allowed them to build the legendary careers they went on to have. In 1995, Tupac signed with Deathrow. Suge Knight didn't just sign Tupac. He bailed him out of prison by putting up $1.4 million to secure his release from Clinton Correctional Facility, where Pac was serving time for sexual abuse charges. Tupac's signing with Deathrow wasn't a traditional record deal. It was more of a blood pact. Suge Knight offered something no other label executive could: immediate freedom from prison in exchange for Tupac's loyalty and 3 albums. Tupac, fueled by anger and creative energy from his time behind bars, recorded enough material for 2 albums in just 2 weeks. Former Deathrow engineer Rick Clifford remembered, Pac was a machine. He'd be in the studio 16-18 hours a day. Suge would bring in food, women, whatever Pac wanted. But mostly, Pac just wanted to record. It was like he knew his time was limited. With Tupac on the roster, Deathrow Records started to regain recognition that even Suge couldn't have imagined. All Eyes on Me, Tupac's Deathrow debut, and the first mainstream double album in hip-hop history, sold over 5 million copies within its first year of release. Suge treated Tupac differently than his other artists. He gave him more creative freedom, more resources, and more personal attention. They became almost inseparable, with Suge referring to Tupac as his brother in interviews. According to many in the Deathrow inner circle, Suge saw Tupac as the perfect weapon in his war against Bad Boy Records. A Deathrow employee who worked closely with both men said, Suge knew exactly what he was doing when he signed Pac. He needed someone with Pac's intensity and credibility to go after Bad Boy. Dr. Dre wasn't that guy. He was too focused on the music. But Pac had that fire Suge was looking for. Under Tupac, Deathrow became more than just a record label. It became a cultural movement. The West Side hand signal became ubiquitous. Deathrow chains and apparel became status symbols. And Suge Knight was at the center of it all, enjoying his position as the most powerful man in hip-hop. Tupac's presence elevated Deathrow Records to new heights, but it also intensified all of Suge's worst tendencies. The more successful they became, the more Suge believed in his own invincibility. And as we would soon see, that dangerous combination would have fatal consequences. With tensions heating up between Deathrow and Bad Boy Records, Dre wanted no part of it. He just wanted to make music. By 1995, Deathrow's offices had essentially become a headquarters for gang activity. Bloods members roamed the halls freely, and so-called business meetings would include known criminals. For someone like Dre, who wanted to focus on his craft and build a long-term career, this environment became increasingly untenable. Former Deathrow producer Daz Dillinger recalled, Dre would come to the studio at odd hours just to avoid all the drama. He'd tell Suge he was working late, but really he just didn't want to be around all those gangsters during regular hours. A major breaking point came when Dre realized how little financial transparency existed at Deathrow. Despite producing multi-platinum albums and helping build Deathrow into a powerhouse, Dre wasn't seeing the kind of money he believed he deserved. When he attempted to examine the company's financial records, he was stonewalled. Deathrow's former attorney, David Kenner, later acknowledged, "The financial structure at Deathrow was unconventional. Artists and producers often didn't receive proper accounting for their work. Suge controlled all the money, and questioning that was dangerous." The arrival of Tupac Shakur at Deathrow further complicated matters. While Dre respected Tupac as an artist, the intensified gang presence and the escalating East Coast-West Coast beef made the label an increasingly volatile environment. Dre, who had already experienced industry beef during his departure from Ruthless Records, had no interest in being part of another war. According to Jimmy Iovine, who would later partner with Dre at Aftermath Entertainment, "Dre came to me and said, 'I can't do this anymore. Someone's going to get killed, and I don't want to be there when it happens.'" The final straw came when Suge Knight attempted to force Dre to produce tracks for an album by Suge's girlfriend at the time. When Dre refused, arguing that he should focus on more commercially viable projects, tensions escalated to the point where Dre felt his safety might be at risk. In early 1996, Dre made the difficult decision to leave Deathrow. He negotiated his exit by forfeiting ownership rights to his Deathrow catalog, including The Chronic, and abandoned his 33% ownership stake in the company. This was a huge financial sacrifice, but Dre felt it was necessary to make a clean break.
He probably wasn't happy with what was going on. He probably didn't like certain things. That's the only thing I could think of. If you start something, if you're a part of starting something and then a different element comes in and alters that, and you don't see yourself fitting into that program, and you don't like the way things are going anymore, you leave. So I'm thinking he didn't like the way.
Dre immediately founded Aftermath Entertainment, taking a $10 million investment from Interscope Records. Suge was furious about the departure and publicly belittled Dre, claiming he had lost his touch as a producer.
Dre's departure wasn't a loss. 2 reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, it was the greatest thing in the world for me. I mean, if you have a multi-million-dollar company, maybe worth $1 billion or so, and you own it 100% and don't have a partner, and you didn't have to give him nothing but his walking papers, that's great. So that wasn't a negative. And Das and all the other little producers and Assassin, all the ones we have, and they did the tracks. Dre wasn't doing the tracks, and Dre didn't write the lyrics, so that wasn't a loss. I mean, Dre didn't do California Love, basically. So that wasn't a loss.
Dr. Dre's departure marked the beginning of the end for Deathrow Records. He had been the label's musical foundation, and without his production genius, Deathrow struggled to maintain its signature sound. More importantly, his exit was a clear signal to the industry that something was seriously wrong at what had once been hip-hop's most powerful label. By early 1996, tension between Deathrow and Bad Boy had gone way past magazines and award show diss tracks. It had reached a boiling point at one infamous holiday party in LA, a night that showed exactly how far Suge Knight would go to protect his turf. It was December, and Suge was throwing his annual Christmas bash at a Bel Air mansion. One of the attendees was Mark Anthony Johnson, a dude who had done promo work for Puff Daddy's crew back in New York. Since Bell was a good friend of Puff, Suge assumed he had classified info regarding his whereabouts. That night, after a few drinks, Suge's men quietly snatched Bell from the crowd and dragged him upstairs to the VIP loft. Behind closed doors, Suge demanded Puff's address. When Bell refused, Suge's crew lost it. They slammed him into a wall, choking him until he gasped for air, after which they eventually forced him to drink Suge's pee.
He might have got a few punches, and he probably drunk about 20 shots of piss. You know what I mean? Literally.
"I thought I was gonna die," Bell said in a later affidavit. "They made me drink that just to scare me. A few days later, Bell hired a lawyer and went to the police. LA detectives opened 2 reports describing assault with a deadly weapon, but Bell never pressed all the way. Word on the street is, Deathrow's attorneys threatened a massive civil suit for defamation, and Bell quietly settled for around $600,000. No jail time for Suge. September 7, 1996, Tupac and Suge were in Las Vegas to attend the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand. After the fight, which lasted only 109 seconds, Tupac and Suge's entourage were involved in an altercation in the hotel lobby with Orlando Anderson, a Crips gang member from Compton. This seemingly minor altercation would later be considered by many as the trigger for what happened next. Later that night, Tupac and Suge were driving to Club 662, a club owned by Suge. They were in Suge's black BMW 750IL, with Tupac in the passenger seat and Suge behind the wheel. Eyewitness Kevin Davis, who was on the strip that night, recalled, "They were stopped at a red light on Flamingo Road. A white Cadillac pulled up on the right side, and someone from the back seat started shooting. It happened so fast, but I'll never forget the sound of those gunshots." At approximately 11:15 p.m., the unidentified shooter fired 13 rounds into the passenger side of Suge's car. Tupac was hit 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the arm, and once in the thigh. Suge was grazed by a bullet fragment, but suffered only minor injuries. Instead of immediately driving to a hospital, Suge made a U-turn and headed in the opposite direction. According to police reports, it wasn't until patrol officers stopped the bullet-riddled car that paramedics were called. A Las Vegas Police Department officer who responded to the scene said, "When we pulled them over, night was surprisingly calm for someone whose car had just been shot up. Shakur was slumped over, clearly in critical condition, but there didn't seem to be any urgency from Knight to get him help." Tupac was rushed to the University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. Over the next 6 days, he underwent several surgeries and was placed on life support. Despite efforts to save him, Tupac died on September 13, 1996, at the age of 25. During Tupac's hospitalization, Suge's behavior raised eyebrows. Despite claiming to be like a brother to Tupac, he visited the hospital only once briefly. According to hospital staff, Suge seemed more concerned with controlling who had access to Tupac than with his condition. Perhaps most suspicious was Suge's response when police attempted to question him about the shooting. Despite being the key witness and the only person who could identify the shooter, Suge claimed he didn't see anything and refused to cooperate with investigators. In the aftermath of Tupac's death, Suge pushed forward with releasing Tupac's posthumous album, The Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory, which Tupac had recorded under the alias Machiavelli. The album, with its dark themes and numerous references to death, further fueled conspiracy theories about Tupac's murder and Suge's potential involvement. To this day, no one has been charged with Tupac's murder. The white Cadillac was found in a Compton neighborhood, but yielded no useful evidence. Orlando Anderson, the primary suspect, was killed in an unrelated shooting in 1998 before the case could progress further. 6 months after Tupac Shakur's murder, on March 9, 1997, Christopher Wallace, better known as the notorious B.I.G. or Biggie Smalls, was gunned down in Los Angeles after attending the Soul Train Music Awards. The timing and circumstances of Biggie's murder immediately led to speculation about retaliation for Tupac's death. And at the center of many theories was one name: Suge Knight. The theory that Suge Knight orchestrated Biggie's murder is one of the most persistent in hip-hop history. While Suge has never been charged in connection with the killing, numerous elements have kept suspicion alive for decades. Biggie was killed in a drive-by shooting while sitting in the passenger seat of a GMC Suburban after leaving a Vibe magazine party. The murder occurred at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue, just a mile from where Suge Knight was sitting in a Los Angeles County jail cell, serving time for a probation violation. The coincidence that Biggie was killed in Los Angeles rather than his home territory of New York raised immediate red flags. Why would a New York rapper be targeted on the West Coast unless it was connected to the coastal rivalry that had already claimed Tupac? When Tupac was killed, everything started falling apart for Deathrow Records. What used to be the biggest label in hip-hop fell apart real fast, with Suge Knight's world collapsing around him faster than anyone could have predicted. Snoop Dogg, who had been the label's second biggest star after Tupac, was the first major artist to jump ship. In 1997, he quietly negotiated his exit from Deathrow, signing with No Limit Records owned by Master P. This departure was a devastating blow to Deathrow's roster and credibility. Dr. Dre had already left in 1996, and now Snoop's departure signaled to other artists that Deathrow was no longer the powerhouse it had once been. The Dog Pound, RBX, and other key artists began looking for new opportunities. The label that had once been valued at over $250 million was now struggling to pay its artists and staff. Suge's legal problems were escalating, and the constant threat of lawsuits and criminal investigations drained the company's resources. In 2001, Deathrow Records filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The once mighty label that had revolutionized hip-hop was now nothing more than a shell of its former self. At a bankruptcy auction, most of the label's assets, including master recordings from Tupac, Dr. Dre, and Snoop, were sold to Wide Awake Deathrow Holdings LLC for $4.5 million. Suge Knight's personal life was equally in shambles. He faced multiple lawsuits, criminal investigations, and was becoming increasingly isolated in the industry he once dominated. The final nail in the coffin came in September 2001, when Suge was involved in a fatal hit-and-run incident outside a Hollywood nightclub. This would ultimately lead to his lengthy prison sentence and complete destruction of what remained of Deathrow Records.